All right, now it's 10 o'clock, so I guess we will we'll let folks catch up. So I think what we probably ought to do, since half of us right now are. Oh, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Okay, not Mark though. Oh, you just don't have audio yourself? Okay, right. Yeah, you're on vacation still, right? Cool. All right, great. Okay, so in any case, I'll introduce myself and then I guess we'll maybe just go around and kind of say who we are and why we're here. My name is Dan Alasso. I teach history at a place called Bemidji State University. It's a small regional university in a state system in northern Minnesota. Because we're such a small department, I teach environmental history and US, which are kind of my fields that I had studied, and also modern world, which I've been actually doing for about 5 years now. And I actually replaced somebody who was focusing on that. So that became part of my portfolio. And so that's kind of what I do. I am interested in writing and in note making. So that was kind of how this grew. I'm also interested in, kind of just talking with people about that and about things that interest us in the content as well. And so we sort of bop back and forth between topical reads and note making related ones like the Solke Ahrens book, or recently. We also did Scott Shepper's Antinet, and so we've so we kind of have some. So it's a, I guess it could go either way at any given time. We could end up spending our time in a morning talking a little bit about note making, or a lot about note making, or a little bit about the content. So I think that is probably what you're going to find here. So I guess what we'll do now is I'll name somebody, and then you can introduce yourself and then name somebody to follow you. So why don't I begin with Judy? You're muted.
Zoom. Sorry. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry. My name is Judy. I live in Utah, and I started following Dan, or I found out about this through the Antinet, Zettelkasten, the online, following it on Reddit and that kind of thing. And as I watched the chat transcript, the chat videos and stuff like that of your other book clubs, and I just was very interested. I'm very interested in the note making, and then I read Dan's books and very interested in just this whole note-taking arena. So I just thought I'd try out the book club too. I've listened to the Antinet one, the Pirate one, and I think that's it. So if Brian wants to go ahead.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, welcome. I've seen you everywhere that I've been lately. Even academia, I got a report that said that you had downloaded something of mine. So yeah, cool. So yeah, over to Brian.
Hello, my name is Brian Hendricks. I am new, first time in one of your book clubs. I'm coming in very late. Unfortunately, I only have 3 chapters read because work has been crazy. So I will be able to catch up by next week. I will miss a couple. Unfortunately, I work in IT, so when we patch servers, it's on Saturdays. So 2 of them I will unfortunately miss. I am a old fart disabled veteran from the United States Air Force, enjoying retirement coming in the next year or two, and looking forward to definitely the material. I live in the buckle of the Bible Belt here in Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. A lot of life changes going on, basically all kinds of belief systems that are going away that fit in right with what you're discussing today. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So I think I will hand this over to Matthew Lowry.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. Nice to meet you, meet everybody here. I'm an Australian. I live in Belgium. My background is in physics, but then I became a science journalist, and now I do a lot of work in consultancy and online affairs to European institutions. I was told about this book club yesterday by Pete Kaminsky. Some of you may know him. And so I haven't even bought the book. You know, I literally did my sync of Dropbox, which I haven't used for 10 years. I synced the vault, the Dropbox folder, and put it into an Obsidian vault literally in the 5 minutes before this meeting started. So I've got a bit of catching up to do. I came to this because I'm working with Pete Kaminsky and Bill Anderson on the Massive Wiki pilot project. Massive Wiki is a project where you share a vault via GitHub and also publish the content of that vault to the web. And it fits in as I got involved in this pilot project after I described the thing I want to do, which is to build what I call a minimum viable ecosystem for decentralized collective intelligence. And Massive Wiki is an example of a new tool in that space, which links together a few things that I want to do. I'm not here to talk about myself, though. What I'm here is I'm trying to figure out how better to use Obsidian, and I love the idea of a book club where when you I haven't even read the welcome start here please page. It's open next to Zoom. So I'm really looking forward just to seeing how this works. I don't know that I'm going to be able to make it every Saturday because it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon here, and usually I'm pretty busy at this time of the day on a Saturday. So thank you very much for bringing me in, and I'll stay in the background because I haven't read the book. I'm looking forward to seeing how this works. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matthew. Yeah, there are a lot of new faces here. So one thing I will mention is that typically we run the chat simultaneously. So when somebody is talking, there's often a side conversation going on in the chat. So I just make you aware of that. So why don't we pop over to Aliman?
Hey, aloha, Aliman from Honolulu. I did my master's in philosophy, Matthew, at KUL in Leuven. So nice to have somebody from that part of the world. I'm CEO of a behavioral health organization here that I co-founded in Honolulu about 16 years ago now. And I've been teaching philosophy at Chaminade University for 20 plus years. And I found Dan through Obsidian note-taking stuff. So when we did the analog Zettelkasten thing with Scott Shepper, I started my physical system in December. So thanks, great to be here. Oh, I'm supposed to throw a hot potato somebody, Mark?
So Mark has, because he doesn't have audio, he has identified, he's introduced himself in the chat. So why don't we go to Pat?
Turn on my microphone. I'm Pat McNamara, retired chemical engineer, spent my career in the chemical industry, the last 20 years in Washington, D.C., representing two different chemical companies. So I'm fairly familiar with government affairs. This is my fourth or fifth book club. I've enjoyed them very much, and particularly appreciate the Obsidian Vault, where we can add our comments, which I've been doing. I hope others would do also. And we can comment on each other's comments. So that's rather interesting. So with that, let me turn it over to John.
Hi, I'm John. Live in the LA area, retired mathematics professor, although I still teach history math online, so it keeps me out of trouble. I discovered Dan's YouTube channel, which I found very interesting quite a while ago, and been on several book club events, and I'm looking forward to this one. I love these kinds of books that sort of correct a common notion, which is mythological. Poorly Understood was a book that we did a couple of books ago, and it was the same kind of thing of what we understand about poverty in America. So I look forward to great discussions. I will throw it to Chris.
Chris might be getting coffee or something. Why don't we go to Kenneth? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, Chris. There you go, Chris. You're connected.
Can you hear me at least?
Yes.
Oh, good. I don't know what my camera issue is this morning. I tried resetting everything twice, but we'll go ahead anyway, and you'll realize eventually I've got a face for radio anyway. I think I've been here for all of the 6 or 7 books thus far. I've noticed since I saw Matthew pop up, I actually thought I had joined the wrong call early in the morning, because I see Matthew in another call during the week. But I've noticed too that there's not as much Obsidian space use as we had way back in the day. It has tapered off, but in hopes of doing what Patrick has said, I've actually written out and thrown together a whole bunch of notes. I just haven't dumped them in yet, but hopefully we'll make some progress. But I approach life as a recovering biomedical and electrical engineer who spends a little more time in the areas of intellectual history and some of the arts and humanities these days. And missed a few on the early side. I'll take a stab and say we should go to Judy.
Judy went, so why don't we go to Tim? Sorry.
I know everybody else too, so.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like Tim, if your cough is in advance, let's go to you.
Yeah, fortunately it's on its last legs. It didn't kill me this time. Next time, maybe. So pretty sure I'm the only guy in the dark as I'm in the Middle East. So it's now 8 o'clock at night. I've come from the systems engineering side of construction and some time researcher into sort of either the physics of buildings or the management of buildings, and have come to this via Dan's various newsletters and YouTube works. And I seem to be the Luddite holdout against this revisionist paper note-taking. And resolutely stayed inside Obsidian.
And Pat has stayed inside the brain mostly too. So there's that. So I think Kenneth, if you can round us up here, we'll finish with you. Last but not least. No, not working right now. Okay, I will say about Obsidian, there have been a yeah, we as Chris said, we have sort of we've been tapering off a little bit. We haven't been doing as much. Obviously, when we were talking about the anti-net and I've been writing a lot of note cards. So there's, I think that has been kind of getting in my way of participating. But I noticed that, yeah, Chris, you've put a bunch of questions in the new folder, and Pat, you've done a whole lot. You've got even a map of content and an index of your cards in there. So yeah, I will. Yeah, if you're having trouble getting, I mean, basically what the way that you do this is you connect to the folder, which the invitation should allow you to do. Either I'm not 100% sure that you have to actually download the app. I think you can just connect to the folder using that invitation, and then you can and then in Obsidian there's that open. When you go to open a new vault, open another vault thing, it gives you a chance to open a folder as a vault, and you should be able to open that folder. Right, so you click on that and then you go to open folder, and it should give you that folder as an option. If that's not happening for you, then yeah, then we can kind of work through that. So and I would like to do a little bit more this book club in Obsidian, and actually I think that would be kind of a nice, it'd be an opportunity for me to kind of get back to it, because I was exploring the note cards for a while. I've been exploring Skrintle, and this will be an opportunity, I think, for me to kind of come back to Obsidian and figure out how I want to continue using it. I really like the idea, what you're working on, Matthew, the massive wiki and kind of this, and Chris has been, several times has sort of alluded to that work of sort of creating a kind of a global shared knowledge system that people can have access to and contribute to and stuff. So yeah, and also something was said about kind of these books, and including the Poorly Understood that we read recently, probably also the Piketty book that we read a while back. Things that, and of course the Graeber stuff all challenges sort of master narratives and kind of entrenched understandings that oftentimes we don't realize are kind of master narratives and are kind of culturally specific. We're swimming in this water, all us white middle-aged folk. So I guess that's something that we need to recognize. And also the other thing that I like about this text is that it does try to sort of take this stuff, although these people are in most cases in the academy, right? They're writing for, most of these things so far have struck me as kind of medium posts, and that at that kind of that level of kind of complexity. So that's been interesting to me too, because I'm very fascinated with how to take insights from history and and kind of bring them into a public discourse. So that's something that interests me quite a bit. So shall we? Some of us met last week. I didn't actually post the video of that meeting, but we decided that we would kind of come back to these first chapters. We chatted a little bit about them, but nothing, super conclusive. There were some questions on chapter 3, the Vanishing Indians, about other texts. So before we started, I went to my shelves and I grabbed a couple of things that I could mention. But do we want to begin kind of at the beginning with the Kevin Cruz, Julian Zelizer introduction and their kind of their framing of what their understanding of the need is and what their plan for the volume? Anybody want to start us off? Go ahead, Tim.
As the non-American, chapter 1 was not as funny as I thought it would be, given the title. And last employer and 20% of the top team for the last major project was American. So it's not like you're as rare as chicken things.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I said last week, in some of your recent rewriting of some of the older English texts, modernizing the phraseology and spelling, etc., there was that guy, Richard Williams, was the guy that founded Providence and therefore Rhode Island.
Roger Williams.
What? Right. Okay.
1635. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, of course, he was English at that point. And his backstory, which I hadn't heard of before, and although you've mentioned him a couple of times in those writings, I came at him from a different angle. He was mentioned within, I think it was post or in the end part of the English Civil War, that I was reading for some other connection that said about him taking a more extreme position, and that led him to go west. And then, of course, he fell out. He obviously made friends with the Indians, but fell out with the bulk of the rest of the English. Got exiled, and then eventually got wrapped up into the local Indian War, even though he didn't want to. And some of his work seemed to be the only thing that I've really seen against the exceptionalism that has continued and grown. And I've got a couple of friends who are, I'm not sure whether one of them particularly has got a US citizenship. He's a resident of Texas, but born in Yorkshire. And I've worked with him across Europe and here. And even though he's a Brit, still sounds like a Yorkshire Brit, but as I say, lives in northwest Texas.
Looks like he froze. I'm assuming y'all see the same thing.
Yes. Yeah. He'll be back in a minute, but I will respond while he's and hopefully he'll hear, even if we're not hearing him. The English Civil War began really in 1640, and so Roger Williams was sort of already on the outs with Winthrop and the Bostonian Puritans. Before that, he does get kind of pulled into, and if you read his accounts of it, he gets sort of unwillingly pulled into the Pequot War. Because it happens kind of closer to him. Maybe Tim will try to come back on. And so there's, it's interesting that the English Civil War actually brought a bunch of Puritans back to the home country, back to England from America, because they wanted to they wanted to support their side. And they were, of course, on the parliamentary side. So kind of responsible for killing the king, or at least, participating in it and not objecting strenuously enough. The exceptionalism thing that is, I guess we've jumped past the introduction into the first chapter. I thought and honestly, I'm okay with that, because I thought that the chapters were better and kind of more, had more meat to them than the introduction. And I'm kind of interested. I noticed that Cruz has a chapter in here later, so it'll be interesting to see how he does with the Southern strategy in chapter 12. But yeah, the idea of exceptionalism is kind of weird, because I actually asked one of my comps questions when I was getting my PhD was, describe and comment on American exceptionalism, and I did not go to the place that they go to here. This whole kind of international communism, kind of a perception of how America doesn't fit into the trajectory of history that is called for by, kind of Marxian or Marxian Hegelian kind of dialectic. I didn't think that I guess I kind of got that. I thought, well, all right, fine. But that doesn't really strike me as the thing that, then they pivot and they talk about, just this idea of the specialness of America. And I think there's a thing in between in that whole, from the period of the early colonies, the things that Tim was talking about. I hope he does manage to come back, about, when the Puritans and the Pilgrims were coming to New England, especially historically, we tend to think of, sort of the southern colonies, Jamestown, and especially the Caribbean, as being very commercial, right? But this city upon a hill kind of myth that we have about New England, that these people came for religious reasons and came for for the ability to not be persecuted in the home country, and and also probably to have a little bit more social mobility and and more of an opportunity in society than they had, because they were sort of obnoxious religious separatists or or dissenters or whatever back in England. But they very, very quickly think of themselves, and I think where Tim was going with the idea of Roger Williams and this impression that he has more, he has a better relationship with the natives, with the Narragansett tribe, or is more open to them, sees them more as human. I think there's probably something to that. It's probably possible to overstate that, but when Cotton Mather wrote about the early period, when he wrote about 1700, this volume called Magnalia Christi Americana, the great works of Christ in America, he said that that when they had arrived, when the Pilgrims and the Puritans had arrived, that the woods had recently been sort of scoured clean of these pernicious creatures, the natives, that to make room, in his words, for better growth, right? That this was kind of a providential thing. So I think this idea of exceptionalism kind of begins with that sense of providence, and then kind of continues through manifest destiny and all these other things. But I'm talking too much here, so I'll shut up. Somebody else.
On the American exceptionalism, the biggest thing that caught my attention, and I see it so much being here just outside of Nashville in the South and Bible Belt and all that, is probably 99% of my friends and acquaintances being in this little town outside of Nashville is Southern, white, and very, very conservative.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how many times I have to keep my mouth shut. I mean, I used to be very conservative. Well, not nutball conservative, but conservative. But the biggest thing I see is my Christian friends always, our country was chosen by God. Our country is pressing forward as chosen by God. We're a Christian nation, which when I hear that, I very politely shut them down. And my military background, being a veteran, and my dad 20 years, my father-in-law fought in Korea. My wife was Army. I mean, I very quickly kick in and say, wait a minute. Okay, I served, my dad served, all my relatives served. We are not a Christian country. We are a free country where any religion can practice. So I don't know what else to say to them, but it I don't want to say taints. It's the filter they're all using when I talk to them. And, you know, I'm gradually losing more and more friends when I take them to task. You know, it's like, just think about what you're saying. That's all I'm trying to ask you to do. And that's the second part of this. And that is what we've lost in this ability. Can we not just sit around a dining room table, drink some coffee, and talk about this stuff? Anyway, but yeah, the American exceptionalism, the biggest thing I see in my life is what I just mentioned, is the religious aspect of it, of, you know, we're special, we're chosen, and that filter they're using. And I'll stop there.
Go ahead. Thanks, Brian. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, Brian, I know you just said that you wanted to stop, but I just wanted to ask you, is this something which is getting worse over the past 5, 10, or 15 years? I mean,
oh, it is. I'm 62, and I remember the day when we could all talk, we could have discussion. But if I had to blame one thing, I would say social media. Social media has made the ability of one person to have a platform, throw out what they say, and it gets over exaggerated. It used to be when you got your news, you waited till 6 o'clock at night, or you read the paper, and things slowly came in. Now we're just deluged. And the ability for people to be influenced on Facebook and Google and whatever. I work in IT, so, and my wife, she tries. She loves Facebook, but that's my wife. She has friends. That's how they stay in contact with family and all this. But even my wife has realized she just stops. She comes to me and shows me, this can't be true. And I said, honey, please don't believe that. The stuff that is put up in front of people's faces when they're on social media, I mean, it's like certain news services. If you watch that, they're going to regurgitate what you believe and always throw it back at you, so you feel good. So that's what's hard for me, by the way. If anybody has come up with that incredible ability to find good information from a source that's not biased, I'm still fighting that. I have tried all different ways, and it doesn't matter, because the thing that's feeding behind it for it to survive is money, and they still have to. But again, yeah, so I'm still old. I get my New York Times, which, by the way, my best friend and he's a veteran too, says it's not worth putting in a bird cage at the bottom. I said, you know what? I like good writing, so I like my New York Times. So, yes, you are. It is definitely, Matthew. It is the worst I have ever seen, to the point where I can't even have a discussion. You can clearly see when you start a discussion with someone where either they don't want to hear it, or they're just listening for their next point to throw in. And I hate that. I mean, I've had the ability to sit down with people and had them change my mind. I mean, so I wish I had this experience happen 20, 30, 40 years ago. But here I am now 62 and starting to read books and realize, wow, that's not really how this stuff happened. By the way, that's what intrigued me about this book and this meeting. Doesn't mean I'm going to believe everything in the book. So far, it's been very good. I've only done 3 chapters. I didn't finish the 5. But the American exceptionalism, you know, other countries must be laughing at us. Like, you really think you're that great? I think we've done some great things. And I think we have the ability to really be a country that helps. But to think that we're exceptional in all ways is just arrogant. I've had that. I was born in Okinawa. I've lived in Germany. I lived in Crete. I've seen some countries that have done some incredible things so much better than we do. So yes, and I'll end here, Matthew. Yes, it is the worst I've ever seen. I do not see it getting better, and that's what upsets me.
Thank you very much. I think it's Chris comes next. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to throw in the anonymity of it too is getting kind of problematic, and I've got a story that I'll tell about threats of violence on my campus through Yik Yak, which I had never even heard of until this week. But I'll tell that story in a minute. Go ahead, Chris.
Did Chris drop? I don't see anyone called Chris.
No, he's still on my screen. Chris, did you want to throw something in? While we're waiting for Chris, go ahead, John.
Yeah, exceptionalism. I was very curious of how that first chapter was defining this, and as most people have already talked about, being exceptional as in the best of something. And of course, it made the case that several countries feel that they're the best at something. But I always thought, when I heard the term used, especially in the political arena, that American exceptionalism meant something like we could do no wrong. And in fact, people have been criticized for criticizing America, thinking that it has done wrong things. Obviously, it has, as being unpatriotic. And that's sort of a step above. And it does mention, I think, in the middle of the chapter, how the definition of exceptionalism has changed and gave us this moral high ground that I'm not sure how much we deserve. Obviously, we've had strong things in history that give us a higher ground, but not completely.
Mm-hmm. There's another kind of maybe less pernicious effect too, where exceptional could also mean that not in quite the deterministic kind of sense of the dialectic of history that they were alluding to in the chapter, but that maybe the typical rules of the way societies develop don't apply in the same way in this North American nation, right? That has this, that has this protection from the rest of Europe. That there are elements there are factors in the way that the United States developed that are different from the experiences of European nations, for example, and that is a different experience. I mean, obviously, in history, every historian sort of has to deal with, and this is an element of this book club, is I have cats that like to participate. That we have this frontier, right? We have Frederick Jackson Turner saying the frontier remade people, and that was certainly a myth of exceptionalism, right? That there was a frontier experience that scraped away all of the European, corruption, or I think in his mind, right? The kind of vestiges of civilization that wasn't really helping us and remade us as self-determining, kind of self-reliant frontiersmen. Certainly that wasn't the experience that Frederick Jackson Turner had in his life. But we accepted, historians accepted that, and we taught the world, we taught Americans that, at least, and all the children of America, that for a long time. But there are elements of the American historic trajectory that are different, and that need to be, that we need to understand differently. This idea of a protected continent, of a continent where there was this tremendous mismatch in military technology between the people living here and the people expanding from the east to west. All these kinds of things. Chris, is your
Maybe
audio
we're
working
back?
now? Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you.
Oh, is that better? Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, if we go back even to the introduction, there was kind of a nice overview of kind of some of the shift in political discourse over the last maybe quarter century or so, and a little further back. But I think they missed an opportunity to kind of put their finger on kind of, here's where the road diverged for where we're going, and why we don't kind of have the same political discourse now that we may be used to. Most towns had 4 or 5 competing newspapers at one point, and you took all the papers so that you could see the viewpoints, and that has dramatically disappeared. But the other piece that I think is missing is the information overload, which we have discussed before in prior book clubs at incredible length. And that's kind of keying off what Brian said. Social media provides a massive information overload for people. So I was actually interested when I started reading this that they have referenced or footnoted a half a dozen history books that I have bought with the greatest intentions of reading in the last 2 or 3 years and just have not found the time and effort. And they tend to be things that are even more academic than this, but that kind of just bleed over into maybe, public, a broader public. But they tend to be academics writing really kind of more dense texts. And I wish I had time to read more of them. I've dipped into a few here and there, but I was super excited to see almost, at least 8 of them have been referenced thus far in my reading now. So I take that to be like a good indicator of I'm on the right track of reading some interesting things. And hopefully this will make me go back to those. But it's, that Brian's social media thing reminds me of, it's a massive cross-cultural book club where no one's doing any of the reading. They're just talking about their opinions. Not to make any of us feel guilty, because I'm sure there are 3 or 4 of us who are well-intentioned and haven't had the time or effort, or the nice thing about this is you can miss a chapter because you're bored with it and you don't enjoy the topic, and you're not totally lost the way you might be if you miss a sentence in Anne Blair and then suddenly you don't know where you're at. Although I don't think she's that kind of writer either, at least in the book we read. But to me, that's, in reading that, I think that's part of the theme is, where's that information overload playing a disconnect in how we miss the actual history and somehow get caught up in the mythology, which makes me. I'll end with the provocative statement that Facebook is the biggest mythology machine on the planet.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, the one thing I'll add to that just popped into my head, the reason I'm kind of on this new journey I'm on, it's not just that the overload of information that's just basically either useless or wrong, because even useless is a waste of time. But it's the stuff I didn't know. I mean, there's just so much stuff I'm learning now that I didn't know. It was never taught to me in high school or college. And I only did 2.5 years of college before I got kind of tired of it and went in the Air Force. But it's the stuff I was never taught. I don't even know I don't know it. And that's why I enjoy this. I enjoy reading the books. People know I go to a lot of coffee shops. I go to coffee shops not because I like coffee, even though I love coffee. I go there because I get to sit down and see all kinds of different people that I don't see here in Fairview. In Fairview, all I see, and it's just the way this place is, all I see is older white people. And the only way I'm going to experience anything different is I picked one in the middle of a very semi-liberal town. But it has a Starbucks that has no drive-through. So everybody has to come in. It is literally a slice of life everywhere. And I've learned more sitting in that Starbucks. I don't know how else to explain it, but that, and I'm amazed at, well, I shouldn't be. I don't want to say that. It almost sounds arrogant. I'm amazed at how much I don't know. Just amazed. That was never shown or taught to me. So anyway.
Yeah. I think one of the things that does strike me about these authors is that this is, there has been revisionism, since the 60s, right? In kind of not only, there's always been revision. All kind of new, histories that make a dent are somehow revisionist, and that goes all the way back to, the Beards and the economic interpretation of the Constitution, which is referenced in here in the Constitution chapter and kind of attacked for being so revisionist and kind of skewing the thing. So there have been there is a I think since Zinn, there's a belief that these revisionism, this revisionism comes from the left, and certainly there has been a lot of challenging of master narratives from the left. More recently, though, somebody in the chat, somebody mentioned "Lies My Teacher Told Me," right? Jim Lowen's book, and that is not necessarily challenging all of these things from the left, and then there are there's book after book after book sort of in that same nowadays in that same vein. So I think it's interesting to kind of see these things from see people sort of intervening from both sides, and then that does give us to whatever extent they engage with evidence, and especially primary evidence, that gives us some opportunity to make some judgments or to have our eyes, unblinkered. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks. And other than the Wi-Fi, if something I say has already been done to death, I apologise. But part of what I was coming to about Tom, my English Texan, was as far as he's concerned, he's in the land of the free. And yet every time he goes home, which he does when we were working on the construction site, he'd do about every 6 to 8 weeks. He'd come back with stories about his son who's having problems because his son lives in a town and he's in a suburb and has an HOA a building. And he wants to plant a different type of tree in his front yard. And of course, all I go is I laugh at him and I go, yeah, land of the free. Oops. And I see in this chapter particularly, there's the pile of stuff about Newt Gingrich and his supposed occupation of that territory. And as has come up in a couple of other of these conversations, I just start with Jeff Daniels' speech at the start of Newsroom, and I concur. It's a bit like the atheist talking to the Jewish Christian guy and a Muslim and say, yeah, you're all right. But you forget that all three of you disagree about which one is right. The one thing I do think, in many respects, is you have taken a model at the time when it was being pushed around, and you tried to jump from being in a slowly very moving to become a constitutional monarchy from that, where it was still, everything was in George III's name, to something with no George. But on my limited reading within this and within other elements of American history, you didn't want party politics, or many of the founding fathers didn't want party politics. Many of the founding fathers had clearly said, this is not a religious item. And yet, it is such a big thing. And you've only got two parties, really. I mean, even the UK has got functioning half a dozen, right? And another 20 odd that puts up candidates to make a point. And yet, we still have to, this is an act for either Elizabeth as of last year and Charlie as of this year. So we still have that restriction. Yet at the last big session of Labour government, they managed to kill off much of the inherited elements of the House of Lords, such that there is very few. And they got rid of the bishops, because obviously bishops used to have a seat of right, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And the elements of the size and the growth and the ability to stay on top, as you have done, clearly comes from the exploitation of the supposed empty, unimproved lands.
Mm-hmm.
And I then have to then turn around and wonder, well, okay, at about the same time, 1770, 1780, we basically did the same to Australia. We'd obviously learned our lesson. We didn't let any good people go. We just sent all the criminals. Effectively, made it a prison. Yeah, sorry, Matthew. And even though it's still within the royalty element, as it were, and it's still part of the Commonwealth, it hasn't done as well in many respects. But then you have to ask, with a number of the books we've said about being, let's do that next type thing, there's an awful lot of this, I wouldn't quite say revisionism, but it might turn out to be that way, of going back to what the indigenous people knew and how they operated. Or even with our first big book, with Wengrove and Crowber, with Candiwalk and the Jesuits, there was elements there that could have turned out better. And then obviously our Mr. Williams might not have been so badly put and had to go and found Providence and Rhode Island. So, and of course at the moment, the other big thing where the US comes up as being first, that is not quite so stupid as in believing about sky fairies and flat earth type things, although that's a different element of it, is the size of the military. You're getting caught up again, and we've been seeing with Ukraine how, yet again, while it's still a proper army to an extent, it's operating much like the Viet Cong as a war of insurgency to keep the Russians at bay, and how successful that is, albeit, yes, there's a lot of support for the actual munitions and all this. So I'm wondering whether this two separate wars need to be twice as big as anybody else and spend as much as the next 26 countries, 25 of which are allies, etc., as it was in the speech, is going to be usefully true in a straight up fight if anybody decides to, let's say, oh, we'll take back Alaska or something. But it's something that will come out. Sorry. But also within this chapter, there's talk about how the nationalism changed and about how the Roman Empire particularly still has echoes to, the best part of 1600 years later, when the last part of the empire disappeared. And I sometimes think, as a lucky Brit in some respects, that I joined a multinational company at day one. And so I've always worked with others. And even when I'm here, and this was almost 20 years ago, so that was at the time when, if you had an Israeli passport, you couldn't come here. You can now, but back then you couldn't. Yet the project I was working on was owned by a secular Jew, and his primary partner in business to build that project was the Sheikh of Dubai. So clearly things have moved on, and they've moved on even further officially now. The workability, and at that point, of course, it was pre-Brexit, so the workability of the European Union was still there. And why was that really there? Was, well, you've got this big power bloc called the US and this big other power bloc called China. And to get about the same number of people and about the same number of resources, you need the European Union. That makes it a three-way split, makes it more democratic by default versus the two-party system that you have inside. And then I also see, to come back to the third big one that was in the original newsroom speech, is how is it that you are such a science technologically advanced place and you go and dump it? If you'd have dumped it during the early years of NASA, for instance, which is still within my lifetime, just about, you wouldn't be able to say you beat the Russians for putting a man on the moon, because they beat you to the moon via a probe, but you still put the boots on the ground first. So I'm still twixt and tween as what this ultimately really means versus is the exceptionalism or that exceptional? Because it works everywhere else. We all think at some point, Brits still think, yes, we were the only people on the Allied side to go through the war from beginning to end. We were the only people to have an empire where the sun never set, etc., etc. And we've got Shakespeare. You've got no chance, So, it's a good and interesting chapter, and dipping in elsewhere and seeing some of the comments about dumping Facebook, but also seeing DeSantis, for instance. I get I still use Facebook at the moment simply because there isn't really the mass of friends and family anywhere else.
Mm.
But it's the one place I use at the moment, rather than me go around all the newspapers, that effectively gives me, albeit an uncurated, it gives me what are my friends interested in. So I use my friends to curate what I'm interested in. And we're having a great, most of us Europeans and Brits that are on that list, are having a right laugh at DeSantis trying to, yes, I can author all the school books, but I can also ban some books. And, you know, at what point is he going to ban the Bible because it's not a good book? is getting to be a true and serious question, right? So my closing story on that is you have to remember that episode of the Waltons, if you remember that far back. It's the period of the Waltons when they've come up to where the Wehrmacht of the Weimar Republic has become the Nazi Germany, and the book burning started up. And John Boy wants to stop the book burning in the village, in the town. And he picks up a book off the pile, realizes what it is, and has to out the German in their midst that's hiding, trying to hide not being a German, and says, but you could read this, right? Could you read some out? So the woman who's been hiding her identity bravely stands up and starts to read. And it's the story of Genesis from the Bible. And everybody in the town then realizes just how bad book burning is. Or banning books, you know. And I just love the way that various libraries and publishers' responses put a public notice up, said, if you send us your email, guys, and you're in a banned book place, we'll send you a copy for free. You know, how free, as in the land of the free, is that? So congratulations to some of them.
Okay. So we're spending a lot of time on this first chapter on American exceptionalism. Do we want to continue on to this second one? Maybe will, not be that far out of off the track that we're already on. But one of the things that sort of jumped out at me from this one was this question of democracy versus republicanism, and how we, have told the story recently in our history about how it was we've sort of framed it in some cases as a question of, whose revolution was it? Because we have these people that call themselves regulators before the revolution, right? And they're closing courthouses or intimidating judges because the judges at this point, pre-revolution in the earlier 1770s, are enacting enacting the laws that have come from England. And then similarly, we have, after the revolution, we have this group of people who call themselves regulators, in the case of like Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebels, right, who are more maybe directly focused on this question of who was this revolution for? Or at least that's the way we frame it, which I think is kind of interesting. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was curious when I was reading this, because I don't know why I hear this a lot, where I hear people tell me, wait a minute, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And I'm like, wait, what? The way I was taught that our republic form of democracy is a democracy. It's just a different type. It's like so I'm like, so what, are they just trying to show that they know something more about history? But it's like, why does that make why do they always make this point of saying we're not a democracy, we're a republic? Well, no, a republic, we're a representative democracy. We're still a democracy. So I've always tried to understand, why do you think you need to make that point? So is there a reason for that I'm missing? I don't know.
Well, I think there is a little bit of debate about the the types of things, about how populist they want it to be, right? And there's this sort of part of the story is that patricians, especially urban merchants like John Adams, John Hancock, those people up in New England, don't have the same idea about popular participation that maybe they're somebody is suggesting that others have. Not so much the Virginians, because they're a bunch of landed patricians, but maybe the Pennsylvanians, right, where they have a unicameral legislature. They have they have no really no types of restrictions to voting or anything like that. So I think that there's a debate that has kind of arisen about the idea of who gets to hold power. And in a republic, I think some people believe that it's more representative. It's more, it's more about the senators, and holding power in a smaller group, and oftentimes, and I think they mentioned it in the chapter, the idea of New England town meeting democracy, right, where everybody comes in and everybody debates. It's certainly not, if we those of us who read Candy-a-Ronk and Graeber and Wengrow together, it's certainly not what the natives had. It's certainly not any type of idea of actual sitting down and coming to consensus, right? It's still a, even popular democracy is still a, 50% of the votes plus one, and you win, and you don't have to pay any attention to what the other side said. So yes, so I think there are too many definitions of the terms, right? Republican democracy, the things that the founders, it seems, when I read their actual writings, they seem to have been aware that, and a lot of people have called attention to this, that republics don't tend to last long. Republics tend to be small geographically, and this is what Amar is talking about with respect to Federalist 10, right? That these republics are relatively small, and they're and they don't last very long in time. They get they become something else. Rome becomes an empire, that sort of thing. I think that the thing that ignores is that they were well aware, and they write a lot about the Dutch republics, which did go on to they get they over 100-year period, depending on whose dates you use, they get their independence from Spain, and they create this mercantile empire, right, with the East India and the West India companies, and so that is, a lot of people see that as a huge success at the time, that this is a model, right? So so what's going on in the chat? Chris is talking about Sanders.
Oh, it's that's more of a side conversation.
Okay, all right.
To this, but one of the things having read Colin Woodard's book American Nations, and kind of this thesis that we're not really the 13 colonies or the 50 states, or and not even the states plus Puerto Rico, which gets no credit at all, or Guam, let's say. But with respect to this particular chapter, that framing is far more interesting in terms of
Just lost you, Chris.
Washington group rather than individual states. And it's almost oh, I know what happened. Am I back?
Yes.
Did you lose me altogether? So we're kind of sitting in the opposite position of the EU and let's say Britain with Brexit over the last several years. The EU was all split up in small countries, individually operating, but they have to get along. And they come to the realization that the EU might be a useful political and economic thing. And then Britain decides, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to go off on our own because we can. So we're seeing that the same experiment America went through, but in reverse and from a different perspective. And I think there are parts of America that now wish, hey, we think we can win, so we're going to try and cause problems, when in reality the prior experiment with the Civil War is, hey, let's just secede and we'll do our own thing anyway. And they realize they can or couldn't or politically aren't. But that becomes then the root of a lot of strife is we're permanently married and we can't get away from our abusive spouse. What do we do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who's going to be the therapist?
Right. Well, and also a lot of the things don't really align and mesh in the way that you necessarily expect them to, because one of the things that happens, right, we have these regulators along in the Piedmont of North Carolina, South Carolina, and they are they're kind of doing their thing. A lot of them, and then we sort of connect them with the regulators of Shays Rebellion, right, later. And we think of them as the same people, but they're not at all. The regulators of Shays Rebellion were people who had fought in the revolution, who were mostly patriots, and then felt that they had been abandoned by the powers in the eastern part of the state, right? A lot of the people who were regulators in North Carolina actually became loyalists and didn't want to break away, and so had a completely different experience. So I think that we make some assumptions about who, and actually just that probably is echoed in this idea that there's been a lot of talk about Sanders in the chat, that populists on the left and populists on the right, are they the same? Are they different? What types of things do they share in terms of their approach to entrenched power as they understand it? Go ahead, Matthew.
No, I put my hand down because it was off topic. It was about how Americans view Brexit, but we're here to talk about America, not the EU. Just because Chris mentioned it. But
yeah,
leave it to the chat if anyone.
It's interesting. You did put it in the chat. Cool. It's interesting how these, the smaller nations working together, to sort of counter some sort of imperial seeming large, China, America, financially and in terms of economic trade. I mean, that's a not American exceptionalism kind of a question, but it is interesting how that doesn't happen. That kind of union of Europe doesn't happen until decolonization, right? Until Europe has to sort of abandon the hope that it's going to be able to continue its, foreign imperialism, either in terms of political and military domination, or even economic. Right. So once I think there's kind of an interesting transition that happens, and really for England, I think or for Britain, I think it begins with the loss of the 13 colonies. Right. I mean, there are, at the time of the revolution, there are about 34 actual colonies, but 13 of them in the center on the continent rebel, and it is a trauma. And it does, right after that, Britain becomes something that they take a different approach, because a couple of decades after Latin America gets its independence, and then they go to the especially the Argentines, right? They say, hey, why don't you guys really focus on hides? Raise cattle on the pampas. Don't worry about industry. We got that covered. And we have, and with actual economic arguments, right? We have comparative advantage, right? We have these economies of scale. You don't need to develop an industrial base, right? You can depend on ours and send us your primary resources, and we will send you back manufactured products. And that's just another imperialism in a different, in an economic guise. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, it was interesting. Matthew mentioned Brexit, and it kind of fits what popped into my head. I have, again, the friend I spend so much time with, our families are really connected. We're only a few miles apart from each other. He, by the way, has a minor in history, so this really blew me away. But when we talked about Brexit, he said, what country would be stupid enough to give up their sovereignty to a larger group? That's just dumb. And then I politely told him 13 colonies, each one had to give up their sovereignty to a national government. And they clearly knew what that meant. According to what we just read in this book, they knew that was exactly what it meant, because it was a source of argument. So he just kind of went, well, but yeah, I just thought that was interesting when he mentioned Brexit. That's exactly what our colonies did. Exactly.
Yeah. And colonies or states, as at this point in time, like Virginia, right? They have a claim by way of their charter all the way to the Pacific Ocean, right? And so one of the biggest initial things that they have to resolve is the relinquishment of these territorial claims. I mean, that's why we have so many Western reserves, in the Ohio Valley, right? Connecticut has to give up theirs, and everybody has to give up their idea that there's something more out there to be had. And the sovereignty thing is interesting, because another way that that more recently we give up sovereignty is, by way of these international treaties. Like, it began with it didn't begin with NAFTA, but a big example was NAFTA, and then TPP coming afterwards, right? Have these courts in them as part of them, right? Where disputes are supposed to be arbitrated in these in this international court kind of a format. And it's in Brexit. It's in NAFTA. We didn't think about it that much because all of the big player corporations at that time were, sort of imagined as being American corporations, right? But in TPP, right, one of the things that was problematic was that now all of a sudden a lot of the players are on the other side of the Pacific, and if they could sue an American state, like the state of California, for example, because California had higher labor standards or environmental standards, or or whatever, and they could force a change in state law, right? Or they could force the state to pay some type of damages to the corporation that felt aggrieved. There's a whole lot of questions of sovereignty and democracy in that whole thing. But I've gone on too long. Go ahead, Matthew.
I just want to come back to something that Brian said when he was, reminding his historian friend that, the colonies actually had to give up a bit of sovereignty in order to pull their sovereignty to gain some independence from a larger power. And he went, well. So when you have these discussions, not just Brian, but everybody, about these issues, and you bring out a fact like that,
mm-hmm.
and people go, yeah, have you changed their mind, or have you just demolished the argument, one of the arguments they thought they used to justify their belief, that they'll find another one pretty quickly? I'm really curious about that psychological thing. And I'm just wondering whether anybody else, had anything to say about that.
Yeah, what do you think, Brian?
The nice thing is, and this is what I share with other people, is like we have a relationship. So he's had time to spend with me. He knows my background. He knows my history. He knows I don't lie. He knows I don't exaggerate. So he can't just say, and he won't, oh, you're an idiot, I can discount you. He won't do that. I know him well enough that he's still honest. But what else could he do? I mean, I see this so much. And nine times out of 10, when I bring something up in an argument, they usually run to the negative. That's not even about it. It's usually something, I don't know how to word this exactly. It's like, yeah, but this, and I said, well, we're not talking about that. Let's get back to what we're talking about. I don't know how many times I have to keep bringing the discussion back to what we're talking about instead of, well, this is how, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. He just did the, well, and I think the reason he did that was the point I made, he just never thought of it that way. He knew it happened, but he just never, no one had ever made that point that, I mean, think of how many things happen and you don't realize what actually happened. You gloss it over, but then when someone points out again, it's like, you're right. They did give up all their sovereignty. Now, there's still states' rights to a certain degree. But I constantly have to remind people that a federal law trumps state law, period, end. Until the U.S. until you take it up to the Supreme Court and they say, no, that's federal law doesn't say that. That's another way our system works. Not perfectly, but yeah, I mean, and I share that people, it's like, that's just how our government works. It has to. There has to be a law that's, that this is it. Sorry, we can't go any higher than this, or we won't work. It just won't work. It's just mechanics.
Yeah. It strikes me that some of that is like, some of having those conversations with people who you sort of respect, that they have a perspective and they have a point of view that comes from their life experience and their educational experience and everything. And it's legitimate. I mean, to some extent, that's like, what Thomas Kuhn said about paradigms, right? That they don't break, immediately the time the first anomaly arises, right? And so for this person who had never thought of that before, well, okay, that's an anomaly. That's something that doesn't kind of fit my worldview, but, isn't necessarily going to break it or cause me to modify it until the anomalies kind of build up to a point where, clearly there's something missing in the explanation, right? And hopefully Pat says we give up our beliefs slowly. Yeah. So hopefully, we have, I mean, and that's sort of my hope with students, because I have a lot of, I see a lot of, I mean, I'm in a very red part of northern Minnesota. Minnesota is kind of thought of as a blue state, but the blueness is like all other places in the cities, right? And we're, 4 hours from the city. And so up here, we're the university is probably a little blue dot in a kind of a red sea. And so a lot of the students, to whatever extent we get, and we do, we pull mostly regional students, they've lived their whole lives, again, swimming in that water. And, with a bunch of assumptions that they aren't going to give up immediately, but that, if they see a different perspective presented in a way that doesn't, bash them over the head with and say, you're an idiot if you don't agree with me immediately, that hopefully that will give them a chance to expand their, the boundaries of their worldview. Go ahead, Chris. Not hearing you yet, Chris.
Oh, that's because I'm on mute. Sorry. One of the other confounding factors here too, in terms of that idea of sovereignty that a lot of us don't notice, is and we could maybe call it the invisible hand of economics, to go back to Adam Smith. But even within a political structure that includes the United States that becomes such tremendously large markets in terms of their size and what they do, that they're able to drag a broader society that ostensibly doesn't want to go there into things like improving the environment. So California can set environmental standards for auto manufacturers, none of which are based in California at all. But because California is such a large car market, foreign entities are now manufacturing cars to California's law standards.
Like EPA.
And they do it, and everyone benefits, whether they want to or not, because it's so expensive to retool their manufacturing lines to not meet those standards. And so in some sense, some places are giving up that, perceived autonomy or sovereignty, and it's going to markets that they aren't a part of or directly a part of or don't have a say in. But that, and that's a level of complexity, I think, that a lot of people miss. And I would suspect that some on the far right are going to try and figure out through the judiciary or other means, how can we blunt California's ability to do that, because we don't think it's a thing, and yet there it is and it's happening. How do those compounding factors that aren't just the simple one level things influence all the rest of what we're talking about as well? And I think that's a piece that's always missing from some of these conversations.
Yeah. Well, and there's probably some interesting details in that history of like EPA mileage requirements. There's probably an interesting story in there about the dialogue between California regulators and the federal government, probably over a variety of different conversations, depending on who, which party happens to be kind of in control of the national government. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. I hope this is going to be maybe a difficult and long answer to what I hope to pose as a very quick, simple question. And it's in digging around this second chapter, particularly about the Constitution. It suddenly dawned on me that the way I've read it to date and the way I've seen things explained and or have shown themselves to be the process that goes on is the Constitution was written at a point in time with a level of technology, understanding, science, and all the rest of it. So things like firearms with a regulated militia is talking about a muzzle-loaded black powder, not even rifled, right?
Mm-hmm.
Personal portable water cannon, basically, as opposed to even something that was used 100 years later, as in something like the rifle that was used during by the British during the Zulu Wars. It's still a single shot, but it's a breech loader, so you're 4 to 5 times more rapid in setting it up to fire bullets.
Yeah,
And
so it's generation.
And there seems to be no, other than you can go back to Congress to get it changed, there seems to be no internal working within the Constitution itself that recognises things like that technological change, that stops it being adaptable without a small sort of revision of, if not that clause, then a whole chunk of other things. Plus things like slave ownership and slave counting in the census as 3/5 of a man. Everybody in that room, pretty much, is a first generation American or a Brit when they wrote that Constitution, such that they clearly understand that immigration is going to continue from somewhere. You know, you make an enemy of the Brits, you get Italians and French and Spaniards come, right, etc. Did they really think that nobody from Africa or Asia would want to come or want to go outside of being stuck like sardines into a ship and traded as chattel? There seems to be elements of no adaptability for future changes. And so you end up with ridiculous arguments as to when does life begin for things like Roe v. Wade, where at that time, we know that there's plenty of abortions going on because that's part of what midwives did. That's where the witchcraft, as it were, resided. And it has done from time immemorial. That it's the women that know how to do that and what was being done, etc. But it seems odd that a country that was, in theory, putting themselves forward as being modern, new, revolutionary, has within its core what appears to be a document that accepts no incremental semi-automatic modification, simply to turn around and say, what happens if these black guys become free people? Do they get a vote? Well, it's the same as most places. They had to be owners of something, property owners. What happens if they became property owners? Yeah. Sherman did the 40 acres and a mule or whatever it was. That made them property owners instantly, more so than their white comrades who may not be landowners. That wasn't there. That didn't seem to come through as automatic. And all of the other movings on, and the last one I would touch on is things like the Fox News lawsuit from the Dominion people, as in technology has moved on. We don't need to count the chads. We can count electronic dots, etc., etc. And yet you still think the election was not true. Yet, in my readings to date, at least 90% plus of all those people actually charged with electoral fraud are Republicans. Or maybe not the people sitting, but their families and friends, wives or husbands, daughters and sons. So on that basis, if there's a pattern to be had is that Republicans are cheats, right? Maybe not true, but that would be the pattern. So why do we think that this
Well, I think there's
this document's so good and modern.
Yeah, I think there's there are two kind of questions buried in there. You asked one about what were the founders, the authors of this document, or the people who negotiated on what would be in, so it was a document written by a committee, which is its first, kind of major flaw, but maybe also its strength, but also this idea that we have built a religion around it of strict construction, right? And that is a tradition. It's not inevitable, right? That's a tradition that the Supreme Court and people arguing in front of the Supreme Court and people writing court decisions have kind of been allowed to promulgate and to run with for their own reasons, right? And that's one of the things that really always kind of fascinates me about, especially about political history and political historians. In my mind, I'm very skeptical of political historians because they seem, in a lot of cases, and I have friends who are political historians, and I tell them this directly, right? That they're more likely than others to believe the rhetoric, right? To believe that what is, that the reasons that people are stating when they're making a case about, about the way that we interpret the founders' intentions with respect to a regulated militia and the right to carry arms and all that is something, or is one way, or we care about it for a particular reason and all that. And so I think a lot of that, yeah, and then there's, of course, there's the additional thing of just, and it came up in the chat, with respect, or at least I thought about it in the chat with respect to DeSantis, right? What is it that he actually believes, and what is it that he actually knows is going to kind of galvanize a group of people. Judy, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about all this. We kind of went a little bit off course from the initial chapters, but I'm curious. What are you thinking? You're muted right now.
I'm just enjoying the discussion. I'm
okay.
Not ready,
Okay, cool. Fair enough. Anybody else? John, Pat, you've been kind of quiet. Give it one. I mean, we're coming up. We're past 90 minutes, so. Well, in the interim, then I will say something. There were a couple of questions about sources for Native history from this Vanishing Indians thing, and I noticed Kelman mentions David Troyer, and I'm personal friends with his brother Anton Troyer, who teaches at my college, and there are several interesting sources. So that's Tony. He has a long ponytail, so. See, he got all of the native looking genes. His brother David, who Kelman cites, is blonde. So he wrote a book. This, I think, was his dissertation, The Assassination of Hole in the Day, who was an Ojibwe native up here. He wrote a really good one called Warrior Nation, which is a history specifically of the Ojibwe and of the Red Lake Reservation, which has the kind of distinction of, I think, being the only reservation in America that did not accept allotment, right? Did not accept the Dawes Act, basically, and alienating the tribal land and cutting it up into plots that were owned by individuals so that it could be further alienated by, kind of pressuring people who were in financial trouble to sell it to white folk. So Red Lake still owns their entire reservation as a tribe, which didn't stop them from selling timber rights and things like that. But they do at least have kind of control over the land. So those are a couple of sources. Colin Calloway as well has written a lot on Native history, and this one kind of interested me. This one is about this is called The Scratch of the Pen, and it's about 1763. So which to me is a really interesting moment because it's the end of the what we call the French and Indian War, and Europe calls the 7 Years' War. And so there's a huge transition going on in the relationship between France and Britain with respect to territories that they don't really occupy, but they do claim, right? And it does say on the map that that this whole territory in the interior, from the west of the Appalachians all the way to the Mississippi, right, is changing hands from. Are you going, Tim? Okay, thanks. yeah, I'll put those in the chat notes, and you can find them.
Do you have
So-
a good general book that you would suggest for someone who on indigenous people and what happened specifically to the United States? Because I know it's a little different in Canada, maybe, but something that's unique, just the United States.
There is a new book that I am not that familiar with called An Indigenous People's History. So that might be worth taking a look at. There is a book, the book that the kind of textbooky book that most people use is Callaway's book called First Peoples. And it was published in 1999. And I think that's probably a good kind of a general, like I said, it's
What
kind
was the name of the newer one you said?
First Peoples.
No, you mentioned another one before that.
This one, The Scratch of the Pen. Yeah, this one.
You mentioned one that was brand new that you didn't know a lot about.
Oh, An Indigenous People's History. Yeah.
Okay, that one.
Yep. Yes. Sorry. And that one, I think, you know, I don't know, personally, and I'm probably betraying my own cultural prejudices or issues or whatever here. The thing that is less interesting for me generally is sort of the cultural interior stories. And so in the same way that I'm not really that interested in you know, in white people's creation myths, I'm not that interested in Native people's creation myths either. What I am very interested in is the relationship that that Native people have had, and the ways, you know, with white, you know, white people, since Europeans have been coming here. And then also, I mean, I'm really, really fascinated by that whole story that that Graeber and Wengrow bring up. And I think there's an article version of that, which is probably in the notes from the Dawn of Everything when we were reading that in the Obsidian Vault. There's also, I'm sure there's a YouTube video version of that. It's called The Myth of the Stupid Savage, I think, is the way that they did it when they did it as a talk. You know, so this idea that that a lot of their thesis was that a lot of the European Enlightenment kind of comes from observations of Native culture, and then especially from these dialogues that people like Candiarant had with Frontenac and Lahontan. There's, you know, in American history, there is sort of this moment of in 1754 of the Albany Plan of Union, right? Which, you know, the way we tend to tell the story is that this is something that Ben Franklin came up with. Some people say that he came up with it after observing the Iroquois Confederacy, and that you know, he sort of proposed it, and it was violently and immediately vetoed by all of the states, right? Because it was a challenge to that sovereignty that doesn't really get rectified until the Confederation fails and we get this constitutional story that we get in chapter 2 here. So so the things that kind of interest me, my ways into Native history oftentimes are the things that are adjacent to this. Because the other thing that happens, of course, in 1763 that we don't, you know, that we don't talk about as much is what we call Pontiac's Rebellion, right? So out on that frontier, there's a huge Indian war, right? And you know, right at the end of the French and Indian War, we kind of have separated it when we sort of periodize these things as historians. But maybe that's a mistake, and maybe that was partially about sort of not including it, not including the Indian part of this struggle between empires, the British Empire and the French Empire in the
One of the things I noticed that I never knew about, again, one of those things I mentioned earlier was we watch very little TV, but what we do watch, there's I noticed that a lot that what I'm seeing come out now is I did not realize there were whole programs put in place in the United States and Canada of not genocide of indigenous people, but taking them out of their culture and trying to make them white. Especially these boarding homes, and I'm not picking on the Catholic Church, but for some reason the Canada, I think, used the Catholic Church as the overseer of that, maybe. But when I started seeing this in one show, and then I saw it in another show, and then I saw it on a third show, I'm like, what is this? And I started looking it up. Then I found out about a train that crossed the United States, started in New England, where they were taking, and this isn't necessarily indigenous children, even though a lot of them were, they were taking children that were just not adoptable, not anything, putting them on this train, sending them out, and generally the Midwest would take them and use them as farm hands. It was just, anyway, it was just interesting, this stuff that you just don't know about until, you know.
So the Carlisle schools, which Chris just mentioned in the chat, these are begun in, right after, during Reconstruction. And so this Army officer named Pratt goes to the Hampton Normal School, which is a Reconstruction era school for freedmen, to train them up in in some type of a trade and to teach them to read. So it's really about that, and it's in Virginia, Hampton, and he goes there and he observes this cohort of Native Americans who have gone through this program as well, and they've had some vocational training, and they've had some kind of civilizational training, right? Learning the 3 R's kind of thing. And he decides to create the Carlisle schools, right? And then the first one's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this, of course, is seen by Native communities as really problematic, right? As this creator of generational trauma, because kids are beaten, if they speak their native language, and they're forced to cut their hair and wear European, Euro-American style clothing. And but this guy, and his motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And I think that was actually kind of sincere. He believed that these people were in danger of genocide, and that this was a solution to keep some of them alive at the expense of having them assimilate into American culture. Go ahead, Judy.
I was just going to say, the Mormons, I'm here in Utah, they, until, I don't know, mid 80s, they still had a foster program for bringing children up from like the Hopi and the Southwest tribes. They would stay with families to go to school up here, but the big push was wanting to convert them, or I think just recently, probably within the last decade or so, that they stopped focusing on that. So it was still going on.
Yeah. Well, and there's an idea, and there's a whole, we tend to think, and I think that this chapter 3, this Vanishing Indians chapter, that kind of mentions "Bury my heart at Wounded Knee" as kind of this thing that, although again, sort of written from a sympathetic perspective, probably sort of promulgates and continues some of these myths. But there is that idea that 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre, is the end. And it is the end of kind of effective Native armed resistance in the 19th century. Of course, it resurfaces again with AIM and their activities in the the 1960s and 70s. So it's not over once and for all. But then there's this whole the 20th century of all these activities of the U.S. government. Some of them well-meaning, some of them less so. Certainly, most of them paternalistic and and based on white opinions of and we did talk about this a little bit last week, but kind of based on either the opinions of whites, educated whites about what the Indians needed in order to survive. Pay my heart at Chuck E. Cheese's, yeah, and also and also, as we mentioned kind of last week, additionally. Very highly educated Native people, right, like Charles Eastman, and and this group of people who who were, many of them, most of them probably, and during the Indian New Deal too, most of the people who get involved, and even in the the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's certainly a period of people stealing annuity monies, right, and using them, to enrich themselves and all of that. There's a lot of corruption there. But even even I think there is a group of well-meaning whites who get involved and then also write the history. And so a lot of these documents that we have kind of come from the BIA archives and all of that. But how many layers do you have to dig through of sort of bias and assumptions and sort of culturally influenced, if not completely determined, worldview before we can evaluate kind of what's going on. Yeah, so as we're wrapping up, thank you, Chris. Next week, we didn't really talk about 4, 5, and 4 and 5. Shall we do? What if we did 4 through 7? Because they seem to be kind of thematically potentially corrected. So that would be Immigration, America First, United States as an Empire by Immervar, and then The Border.
It works for me.
Okay. Okay, cool. And then we'll, because then the next group together would be Socialism, the Marketplace, the New Deal. Might be kind of another opportunity to take a look at economics. Okay, so then next week, 4 through 7. Cool. Who wants to have the last word?
I'll do it, only to say thanks, Dan.
All right. All right. Well, thanks. Thank you all. This was fun. I'm happy to see new faces, and yeah, and let's continue next week. Ciao.
Have a good one.
Bye.